Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today and for joining another Kepler webinar. This time for us to present you our winter outlook for 2025-2026 for global LNG and European natural gas. My name is Ronald Pinto. I'm principal analyst for Kepler Insight. So basically, I focus on the analysis and modeling of the European gas market and global LNG. I'm joined today by three of my colleagues, Go Katayama, who is also principal analyst taking care of Asian market analysis and modeling, and Charles Costruz and Arturo Regalado, who are both senior analysts covering global LNG and European gas markets. With that, let's just go through the agenda. So basically here, as I said, we're going to present to you our winter outlook for global LNG and European natural gas. So I guess like worth mentioning the definition of the winter period. First of all, like we define this winter period as the period going from October 1st to March 31st. In terms of the agenda, we're going to start by giving you just a quick recap of what happened during summer 2025 that just ended a couple of weeks ago, and yeah, the dynamics that we saw in global LNG markets. Then we'll do a dive into what we're seeing in terms of LNG supply and demand for the winter period. Then we're going to take a look at a closer look into dynamics taking place at, within the EU27 perimeter and the outlook for the region. Then we're going to leave a few minutes for Q&A. Please keep in mind that you have like this Q&A button towards the bottom of the screen. Like, feel free to ask us questions, and we're gonna try to answer them all towards the end of the presentation. Other than that, we'll get back to you via email if we don't have the time to do it like during the webinar. And at the end, we're going to have also a few minutes just to give you a quick overview of the Kepler LNG terminal so that you can actually optimize and know how to monitor the market, particularly during this winter. Let's start with that summer recap. Yeah, I guess like it was a very eventful summer, you know, from geopolitics to fundamentals. I think the best way to talk about this is to split this into supply and demand. And yeah, the main story on the supply side was, of course, you know, additional supply coming from the U.S., adding more liquidity to global LNG markets, particularly in the Atlantic Basin. As you can see here, summer growth in the U.S. was above 10 million tons in exports. So we can see that, you know, like across like all the players, like was the only one where we saw like this a significant increase. Another thing that we can mention was like this is like decrease in Russia, mostly driven by maintenance taking place at the Yamal facility, and also no exports from sanctioned LNG facilities of Russian origin. When it comes to demand, we can point to different stories taking place there. During the summer, of course, Europe had to go out to the market and get more LNG to make for the loss of Russian gas supply via Ukraine, but also to kind of like ramp up storage injections as the region had ended winter with only 34% storage levels after the end of the previous summer. So with that, of course, you know, there was no choice, you know, just like going to the LNG market and get all these volumes. It was also helped by the fact that we saw this bearish momentum taking place in China, right? So as you can see here on the right, so basically in China we saw a net reduction of summer on summer of around 6 million tons, mainly driven by higher domestic gas production and higher pipeline imports from Russia and from Central Asia. Another story that was quite interesting to see was the confirmation of Egypt like becoming this net importer. So that basically drove this increase in imports from the Middle East. So where we saw like a summer on summer increase of around 10 million tons. Of course, we also had like other trends taking place there, like in South Asia and Southeast Asia, where prices still remained high for price-sensitive players to, get more LNG. So like we saw some net reductions there. Also, the early arrival of the monsoon season in this part of Asia also like reduced the need for LNG in those markets. And then like we saw, of course, like some increases in South Korea and Taiwan. In the first one, mostly driven by opportunistic buying during the summer season, and we saw like some net reductions in Japan as inventories remained healthy and nuclear generation, continued increasing. So that's some of the trends that we observed during the summer season. Now we're going to talk about supply and our winter outlook. I'll give the floor to Charles Costrus.
Thank you very much, Ron. Yep, so I'll be covering the LNG supply outlook. So here all the numbers are taken from Kepler Insights' latest monthly reports, which was published just last week. So if we move to the next slide. So here LNG supply for this winter is set to grow by 22 million tons compared to last winter to reach a total of 236 million tons. And we can already say that the outlook is much more positive compared to the previous winter. Indeed, we saw very little growth in the previous winter, 24-25. We were expecting very little growth, and we actually saw slightly negative supply growth last winter. So for here, this time around, it's a much more positive outlook. So if we look here at the chart on the left-hand side, we're showing where this extra growth is coming from, and we can see that it's the Atlantic basin here that's really leading the way with 21% growth compared to the previous winter. We have as well some limited growth in the Pacific basin, relatively sluggish growth in Africa, and a very slight decline in the Middle East. If we drill down on the country level on the chart on the right-hand side, we can see here really how the US is leading the way for this winter and is responsible for over half of all the extra LNG that's set to come online during the winter, with an extra 13 million tons thanks to projects like Plaquemines and Corpus Christi Phase 3. We have as well some additions in West Africa and the Pacific Basin, with notably the LNG Canada project with 5 million tons of extra LNG. Australia as well, with the notable restarts of the Darwin plants to be mentioned. In terms of supply reductions, we have some minor reductions in Qatar due to heavier maintenance compared to the previous outlook, as well as some underproduction issues in Malaysia. But overall, a very positive outlook for this winter. If we move to the next slide, focusing now more on the project level, showing the liquefaction projects set to come online during the winter. And these projects will add an additional 23 million tons of additional nameplate capacity during this period. And this extra capacity will be able to serve both Atlantic and Pacific basins. Focusing first on the US projects, so Plaquemines the last block of 2 trains is set to be completed by the end of this month. And so the plants will be reaching its full nameplate capacity of 22.5 MTPA by the end of October. Corpus Christi Phase 3 is actually advancing ahead of schedule. Cheniere is expected to bring up Train 4 and Train 5 by November, and we've actually brought forwards the timeline for this project by 2 months compared to our previous monthly report. And finally, the Train 1 of Golden Pass Terminal, decent progress being made there. The operator did submit its semi-annual report to the US Department of Energy in late September. And we've also moved the forecast for this one up by a month for a March 26 startup. On the Pacific Basin, as we mentioned, LNG Canada set to come up. We did have some operational issues at the plant in the last few weeks, but the outlook for Train 2 is on track, and we have a startup for the end of the year. And in Australia as well, the restart of the Darwin plants. We had first gas produced last month, and we expect first LNG for December 25. So As always, with these new projects, delays is always a risk. So the timing of when these projects come online is a source of uncertainty here for this winter. We could potentially see some delays at the smaller Congo FLNG plants due to kind of the timelines of similar projects in West Africa that we've seen in the past. But apart from that, everything else here seems to be relatively on track for this winter. If we move to the next slide, to finish off the supply section, spend a few minutes here on the Arctic LNG 2 terminal in Russia, where the second train of 6.6 MTPA has been online since the month of September, but has been struggling with some electrical issues. So all the volumes from Arctic 2 have finally found a home in the southern Chinese port of Beihai, which has been exclusively importing Arctic 2 cargoes there since the end of August, and in turn, all Arctic 2 cargoes end up in Beihai. But so far this year, the plant has exported 0.6 million tons, and our base case for Arctic 2 LNG for the winter period is 1.5 million tons of exports, as you can see on the blue bars on the charts on the right-hand side. So in this base case scenario for Arctic 2, we assume that China will continue to draw in these sanctioned cargoes, which has been so far unchallenged by the US administration. There is, however, a logistical constraint to our base case, which is the fact that there's only one ARC-7 vessel that's available to pass through the Northern Sea route, which is completely frozen over in the winter months. And almost all of the other ARC-7s are stuck in South Korean shipyards. So that's going to be limiting the amount of cargoes that can be lifted from the plant. We've also considered potential downside and upside scenarios for Arctic 2. So on the downside one, this would assume a potential clampdown on Chinese buyers by the US administration, as well as more technical issues at Train 2. And this would entail no more exports after the month of October, so a total of 0.2 million tons. The upside scenario would be having one more ARC-7 vessel, available later in the winter, and that would be the only one that's not currently stuck in a shipyard in South Korea, and that would enable more volumes to be shipped. We would also assume the technical issues at Train 2 being resolved later in Q1 26, and that would entail a total of 2.2 million tons for the upside scenario for the winter. However, given kind of current geopolitical situation at the moment, the downside scenario would remain more likely than the upside. But in any case, the base case scenario remains the favored outcome for now, with 1.5 million tons of exports from this plant coming online this winter. With that, I'll pass on to my colleague Go for the demand outlook.
Thanks, Charles. So all this 22 million tons of additional supply expected this winter, this section will go over where will that supply be absorbed on the demand side of things. Next slide, please. Yeah, so I have about 5 or 6 slides for this section. And so for our base case, we're showing here for the winter, again, from October to March of next year, we anticipate a 20 million ton winter on winter growth, and that's 232 million tons this winter. And that's the growth is slightly lower than the supply growth as we account for the boil off. So you can see on the yellow bars on the right is our forecast this year, and we see a lot of increases across many different regions. Of course, in our monthly reports, we go through each of these regions and countries in more detail, but here from a regional level, we see Europe and Asia to make up half and half of that 20 million ton growth, of which Europe will see a 9 million ton growth this winter due to lower net pipeline supply, as well as Atlantic supply growing, as you saw from Charles' presentation earlier. We'll give more information on the European side of things in the next section. But moving over, China, of course, last winter was very mild, warm winter. But this winter, all of our models are pointing to a 5-year average for Asia. So we do see some upside in gas demand for heating. So we do see China recovering 5 million tons to 40 million tons this winter. We'll go through China in the next slide. Of course, Japan, Korea, mainly stable winter on winter. Taiwan, we see some growth. As we see more fundamental gas demand growth as the nuclear has shut down earlier this year and the third terminal is active. And then, of course, with the new supply push, we do see lower spot LNG prices. So this is mainly going to affect the price-sensitive markets such as South Asia, Southeast Asia. And we do see some upside in India of around 2 million tons this winter, as we see lower domestic gas output and lower prices stimulate some demand in this winter. Southeast Asia is a combination of different countries, but countries like Indonesia prioritizing the domestic supply of gas will be calling more LNG, and lower prices will stimulate more demand in this region as well. And similarly to what Ram was showing in the summer outlook, Egypt is also hauling many FSRUs, and the struggling domestic production will continue, resulting in higher winter year-on-year growth for Egypt. Next slide, please. Yeah, so one of the key markets we're following very closely in our market pulses and our monthly reports is China, obviously the largest market. And we saw very big demand destruction this year, but we do see some demand recovering this winter. On the left-hand side, we show you a waterfall of the winter-on-winter changes on the demand side in green, and also on the supply side on the red. And working from the left to right, last winter demand for gas was 48.4 BCM, but we do see gas demand recovering, increasing this winter, mainly driven by truck LNG. The truck LNG diesel spread favoring the LNG truck sales, so we see some boost in LNG truck gas consumption. The ResCom sector, these are all like non-power sector drivers, by the way. The continuing of urbanization and increasing urban population, as well as the colder than average winter that we expect in our models for this 5-year average this winter, as opposed to a mild winter last year. And a lot of pipeline connectivity increasing in the Northeast will enhance the ResCom demand this winter. So that's accumulating for the big green box on the left-hand side. But at the same time, we're kind of working our way towards how much is LNG demand growing this winter. Domestic production is continuing to grow on the supply side, a stronger down gas by the 14th 5-year plan, mainly driven by like Sichuan, the shale gas in Sichuan, CBM in Shanxi province, and shale gas outputs from conventional gas output from Inner Mongolia continues to drive this growth, particularly in Xinjiang. So a lot of the gas demand is met by domestic production, as you see in the waterfall. And pipeline growth this winter is unfortunately a little bit limited. There is some growth. This is Power Siberia 1 growth, but most of it ramped up last winter. So the huge growth that we've seen throughout most of this year is not to be seen too much this winter. Most of the gas demand will be met by domestic production, some of it by pipeline imports, and some of it by inventory drawdowns. But the remainder of it, around 6 BCM or so, has to be met by LNG demand to make up for the growing gas demand. So we do have 5 million ton LNG demand growth in China in our base case, tendering that we do have a 5-year average cold temperatures in China. Yeah, next slide, please. And then for the mature markets in Japan, Korea, and Taiwan, most of the growth from this region is driven by Taiwan. As Japan and Korea, we see limited growth this winter. Mostly stable demand in Japan at 35 million tons in this winter, in Korea at 25 million tons. It's pretty similar to last year. We do see higher nuclear availability in the first half of the winter, especially in Korea, but it's pretty much balanced earlier in the year as more maintenance happens in the first few months of the year. And Korea also cannot forget that this early winter, Korea did have a very cold winter where they pulled many cargoes in February. So that's sort of the tilt that balances the market, as we have a 5-year average view. So it's slightly on the bearish side compared to last year for February so far. But the Taiwan story, again, the end of nuclear in the middle of the year, as well as the third terminal starting up is boosting gas demand. So every month we've been moving our Taiwan model, and demand is increasing. So we do see a 3 million ton growth this winter on winter due to these factors, and Taiwan reaching about 13 million tons this winter. Next slide, please. And then at Kepler, we do follow very closely the LNG inventory levels, and this is a very good indicator for spot LNG. How hungry are these buyers, end users, willing to get out to the market to procure spot cargoes? A lot of the government agencies do provide historical data, but we apply that with our demand models to apply a nowcast, so it's more usable for our clients and users. But for most of this winter, the green dotted lines are nowcast and forecast, and then the blue dotted lines are the next January, February, March forecast. We do see healthy inventory levels throughout the winter. Korea in August had a very big spike in LNG imports, record high LNG imports for August, and that boosted inventory. And Korea usually has a very high spot exposure compared to Japan, and a little bit more price sensitive. But we do see healthy levels in Korea going forward. Japan has a lot more term contracts, so the band of the reliance on spot is a lot less than Korea. So you see a lot less gray area, but we do see Japan relying on term contracts, and they're pretty in a good position for this winter. Candid, we have a normal 5-year average cold winter, and so pretty healthy above the 5-year average lines with black dotted lines for Japan. China has been at very high levels, and this has been a key driver for our bearish call on JKM and spot Asian prices throughout the year, and they're still hovering above 70% of LNG inventory. So we do see that continuing. Some inventory usage through the winter and dropping, in the mid 60s, but far above the 5-year average that we've seen, which is around 40% that we show on the right hand side. So this is going to continue to give a lot of pressure to JKM prices, and we don't see too much competition with Europe this winter in Asia. Candid, again, we see a 5-year average temperatures and inventories are quite healthy at the moment. Next slide, please. Yeah, and then in our modeling, we do a lot of scenario analysis as our clients like to see some variances from our base case. And so one of the two key variables that we looked at for the Asian demand side are two variables on the heating degree days, on the cooling degree days, as we have a northern hemisphere and southern hemisphere Asian countries, which have different profiles in the winter, as well as spot LNG prices. I did mention earlier that we do see a return of Southeast and South Asian countries demand, as we, Asian spot prices, we average about $11 per MMBTU this winter, as opposed to $14 last winter. So there's a lot more incentive for opportunistic buying this winter. But what happens if we lower the Asian spot prices by $2 on the demand upside case? And what happens if we increase Asian spot prices by $2 on demand downside sensitivity? So we do have our results on the right-hand side. The left-hand side gives you by country to compare how these will result. And China, obviously, the biggest market, has a big volatility in the risk analysis. And on demand upside, the red dotted boxes, these are the countries that have heating degrees day, more heating, increase to the 5-year max levels. And that would boost mostly South Korea LNG demand over the 6 months by 1 million ton, China by 0.6 million tons. Japan not so much of a volatility there, but yeah, and India, Thailand, Bangladesh, South Asian countries would see in this case more cooling. They're in the southern hemisphere for the upside case, and so you would see some upside in Thai demand by like about 0.6 million tons. So all of these key countries that we do see on the upside of about 2.5 million tons for the winter scenario. The upside, and then the lower spot price would be mainly China impacted. We would see an upside of 2 million tons over the 6 months from China, with LNG spot prices in Asia are average around $9, as we see good evidence that when Chinese spot LNG prices go below $10, we see a lot of demand, opportunistic demand in Asia, especially in China. So it's a big one to watch here. And then on the downside, we also see less heating and cooling. And again, China and Korea are the biggest influenced here by 1 million ton each for the weather-driven impact. But if spot prices are increased from $11 to $13, then we do see demand destruction of the other way, with 2 million tons over the 6 months for China. And some sensitivity in other markets like India, Thailand, and Bangladesh, but not as much movement there, as imports are quite smaller than China. But yeah, China is obviously the big one to watch here, and just wanted to show the variances on our base case if we happen to get a much cooler, much hotter, temperature, as we could get La Nina during the winter, and that could, boost up demand, giving us more of the blue shaded area results for this winter. Next slide, please. Yeah, and finally, this is the same scenario, but we're just showing through the month, and mostly quite balanced upside downside. As you can see, the JKM, the spot price impact is pretty even throughout the months by all the countries, but the temperatures variances are different by month, but quite balanced. I think summer risk scenario, we showed that there was a much more of a skewance. In August was peak variance on the low and the high side, but for the winter, it's quite balanced. As we've in our base case, we show the 5-year average temps in our base case. So this is something we wanted to show here. And then obviously for here, this one as well, we do some less variability in the months of October and March. Going into late fall into early spring, we do see less kind of a volatility on the demand side. But yeah, February key point, there could be some net upside skewing to the higher end based on our balances and modeling. There's something to watch out for. Yeah, I'll stop there on Asian demand and pass it back to Ron to go over Europe. Thank you.
Thanks, Go. And hi, everyone. It's me again. So like right now, just to talk about EU27 natural gas and LNG outlook. Our main takeaway is that we're going to see LNG imports into the region to increase by 14 BCM winter on winter. Just as a reminder, like all these results, like from Asia and what they're gonna see now in Europe, they're part of our bottom-up modeling approach. We've developed models for each of these regions that allow us to capture the granularity and the dynamics taking place, in terms of gas consumption and how that translates into LNG imports. We also take into consideration pipeline supply and storage dynamics. So yeah, that's part of the work that we're showing here. When it comes to Europe, I think like it's worth kind of like going through what happened during the summer in a bit more detail, as some of these factors also will affect our outlook for the winter. Of course, main point of attention was like the increase in storage gas injections at the EU27 level in this summer 2025. The EU27 injections were at around 54 BCM. So this is 12 BCM higher than in summer 2024. Again, mostly driven by the fact that Europe had to replenish low gas storage levels that had started the summer season in 34%, and it ended actually at 83%. Of course, when we have to think of what drove this, we have structural drivers. So first of all, we had a lot of discussions around the European gas storage regulation that was amended this summer. Also higher LNG supply and the sluggish Asian demand, as Go and Charles talked about. And then of course these kind of structural changes, they impacted the market sentiment throughout this month. And this is quite obvious when we see the seasonal spread and how it changed gradually during the season. That basically that is what we can see here, this difference between say what we had in May and what we had in August and September actually drove the injections, very solid profile injections into UGS facilities during the summer. Of course, in the case of Europe, we had more specific events, also driving these injections. We had a warmer April compared to the previous year. We also have incentives given to Italy's SSOs, so that they could actually go to the market and attract more LNG and pipeline supply. We also had additional facilities being added to the LNG infrastructure at EU27 level, and more recently we had lighter Norwegian maintenance that actually then made more gas available for injections. When it comes to pipeline supply, what we can see is that, of course, summer we can see this reduction from 81 BCM to 74 BCM. Most of the driver was like the loss of Russian gas supply via Ukraine. This is the first time that we're facing, I guess like summer without all that supply. But like, it's not only that, right? Like part of this loss that of almost like 10 BCM that we had like on net supply coming from the east corridor is also attributed to some of that to exports going to Ukraine and Moldova. As you know, like Ukraine has been more reliant on imports from the European Union after the attacks on upstream infrastructure in February, and more recently, a few days ago, also like additional attacks in infrastructure. So so like that's part of like the main driver that contributed to the decline in net imports at the EU27 level. But we've had also like some other stories, like in terms of like others here, we're accounting for volumes that came from the UK with very low domestic demand like during the summer season, and also the fact that Norway had a very good summer in terms of overall output. So like that made more volumes like being available from the UK to the continent. We had like net reductions in supply coming from North Africa, mostly from Algeria and Libya. If we compare that with what happened on the demand side, we saw a decrease overall in of 2 BCM in overall EU gas consumption. This is mostly driven by the fact that industrial gas consumption continues to be lower year on year. At the very beginning of the summer season, it was still impacted by the high summer prices that we had at the very beginning of the year. But like then, since then, of course, it's like overall industrial output that continues to weigh on overall gas use in the industrial sector. This decrease in industrial gas demand was enough to actually more than offset like just a very slight increase in gas-fired generation that we had during the summer season at EU27. And of course, when it comes now to LNG imports, as it was highlighted before, like the EU27 region imported a lot more LNG. We saw an increase summer on summer of around 15 BCM. And this was like supported mainly again like additional LNG supply coming into the Atlantic basin, but like also the fact that we had like more LNG infrastructure being added to the continent, especially with additions of Wilhelmshaven 2 and the Ravenna facility in Italy. So like you can see like the profile, basically most of the increases being driven by gains in imports in Northwestern Europe, but also in Southern Europe. With that, I give the floor to Arturo, who will walk you through the assumptions of our winter outlook.
Thank you very much, Ron. Thank you very much for this rundown on what happened in the European gas markets through the summer. For the remaining part of the webinar, I will be going through our base case scenario for European gas markets, and also telling what are the base case assumptions, and then we will go through some sensitivities and risks as we move into the forecast horizon. First, just some reminders about our modeling framework. Our analysis period goes from October to March, just so that if you see any comparison that we say or mention that it's year on year, it actually refers also to the same year, same months, October, March of the previous year. We're now also leveraging the capabilities we have on our modeling approach, as we now have bottom-up sectoral supply and demand models for 8 European Union countries. This represents around 75% of total EU27 demand. And for the rest of Europe, we do this on a top-down aggregate approach. We're also integrating our Kepler power data service, and this allows us to have a very good modeling capabilities in terms of gas for power demand, as we now are also able to make or understand what's the competition between gas and other elements of the power generation mix. Some also market and weather conditions to take into consideration as we go into the base case scenario is that we're forecasting already a colder than average October. Our base case scenario already assumes there's going to be a colder than average October. and a slightly milder November. This is based on EC46 forecast, and for the remaining of the forecast horizon, just as it was the case with the LNG demand in Asia, we're also assuming a 5-year average. We're also expecting some slightly higher wind utilization rate in early October, particularly the first couple of weeks of October, consistent again with these EC46 outlooks. And for the remaining of the competing technologies in the power generation mix, we're assuming some 5-year average utilization rate. And finally, just a couple of assumptions on the supply side. We don't expect any return of Russian gas supply via Ukraine during the period, during this winter. And we're also incorporating now the first stage of the phase-out plan on Russian gas supply. So please, Ron, if we move to the next slide. And here we're showing what's our expected EU 27 gas balance for our winter 2025-2026 forecast. And I can just sum it up as saying lower demand, but also a shifting supply mix. As you can see in your plot to the left, we're expecting some 2 BCM lower winter demand gas consumption year on year. This is driven basically also by our assumption of a 5-year average for temperatures going forward, because last winter was on the colder side of this range. Obviously, this also leads to some decrease over here. Also, some installed capacity additions and renewable technologies that eat into gas for power demand, and this results in this 2 BCM loss. And here on the right-hand side of that same chart, we can see how we expect supply to be changing to accommodate for that demand. Basically, we see domestic production to remain basically unchanged, flat year on year. We expect lower pipeline imports, but I think the picture is more nuanced than just this minus 4 BCM, and we can see this on the plot to the right-hand side. That less 4 BCM less net of pipeline supply actually is driven by several factors. First, we have the loss of Russian supply via Ukraine, which accounts to more or less minus 3.7 BCM. But one important component of our forecast that we're already expecting is increased exports to Ukraine. As Ron mentioned, there's been strikes to gas infrastructure facility. Ukraine has been importing strongly through the summer. We expect this to continue into the winter. If anything, the attacks of the previous week just show us how volatile the situation can be, and there's still a likelihood that strikes to gas infrastructure will remain going forward. So that's why we have this increased export assumption for Ukraine. We're also expecting some tighter Algerian and Libyan flows, driven mainly by maintenance into Q4 2025. But then there's also some upside. We have Norwegian supply increasing by 1.5 BCM. This is on the face of no major unplanned outages. Also, Norwegian supply has remained quite robust during the year. We expect it to be the case going forward. So that's an upside for pipeline supply. We also are already accounting for higher Azeri gas flows, particularly due to the TAP increased capacity beginning January 2026. We also see some higher wind utilization in the UK, which frees some gas that can be going into the continent. And if we go back to the other chart with the balance, we can see that there's going to be lower storage inventory drawdowns. But basically, this is also because we're expecting higher BCM imports and it to be offsetting all the loss of pipeline supply and the lower inventories, which, if we can please move to the next slide, we can see where these LNG imports are coming from. And these LNG imports are rising essentially on the fact that we have increased Atlantic supply. As my colleague Charles was mentioning, there's almost 25% increase winter on winter change in Atlantic LNG supply, which Europe is taking advantage of. And also, given the current price conditions, we expect LNG imports to keep increasing and to cover these other parts of the balance. This will be mainly consumed in Northwest Europe, which we define as Belgium, Netherlands, France, Germany. And then we have also Southern Europe, Portugal, Italy, Spain, consuming the rest of it, and then rest of EU, some marginal volumes over there, as you can see here in our profile. One of the of the conditions we can do now, and some of the analysis we can do now, it's improve LNG forecast, because we also now consider very granular key LNG maintenance events. As you can see there in the table to the right, there's some strong LNG maintenance, as we define by 15 days or more of unavailability, and we have this kind of front-loaded into October, but as we move into the forecast horizon, there should be less, it should be lighter, and this should allow Europe to keep receiving the LNG cargos. We are also expecting a couple of important additions. One is the Rovigo terminal in Italy, 1 MTPA, then Zeebrugge as well by the end of the winter. We're also seeing an increased capacity expansion in the Croatia's KRK. However, even if it's a 2.6 MTPA expansion, we don't expect any meaningful contribution this winter, just because of the pipeline bottlenecks that exist in the Southeastern Europe region. And if we go now to the next slide, the implication of this higher LNG availability and also the lower demand is that we're expecting a very improved storage outlook backed by these two factors. And as you can see, we're forecasting, if you look at the line, at the green line and the dotted line, that's our forecast for October, for end of October field levels, which we expect to be around 84%, so some 10 percentage points lower than last year. But with this all higher availability and lower demand, we then see that going into the forecast and ending winter, we'll actually be at very similar levels to what happened last year, which we were around 34%. We're forecasting now 35% field levels by the end of winter, which is very similar. But this also just to say that we have higher LNG imports, lower drawdowns, and this is making for an improved condition over there. Also, maybe getting in my head ahead of myself, but remember also that in between, in the middle of 2026, we're expecting also strong capacity additions on the LNG export capacity, which then allows this to, even if it's a relatively lower field level, it's actually comfortable because there will be enough supply to keep continuing this filling operation next year. And now, Ron, please, we can move to the next one. That was our base case assumption, but of course there are risks to these conditions. We are always monitoring this, and we also now have the capability to actually go through modeling some of these sensitivities, which we'll go over on the next couple of slides. But just to mention some of the key bearish risks we see to our European gas market is that we can actually have the warmest winter in the last 5 years. We're now assuming a 5-year average, but it could be the case that we have a cold, warmer than average winter, which will reduce in turn heating demand principally, which will reduce overall total gas consumption. There can also be the case of higher than average load factor for wind generation, which will result in a higher displacement of gas in the power mix. And also another key risk we're continuing, and as my colleague Go mentioned, we see weak Asian demand, so not much competition for LNG cargoes, or not as strong as it was last winter, leading to higher availability of supply to Europe. Now, if we can also look at the bullish risks, there they have the opposite. We can have the coldest winter in the last 5 years. This will depend on how the weather forecasts keep moving, but we can also have lower than average load factor, which will mean we require more gas into the power mix. And one very important one that we are following is higher possible pulling from Ukraine, especially if we see continued attacks on the infrastructure that will reduce Ukraine's capacity to consume gas. Then we also have any other unplanned maintenance or outages in pipeline, nuclear, and other factors. So just to finalize the webinar, Ron, if we can move to the next slide, please. We want to show you some sensitivity and scenario analysis we did on 2 key variables. We did this for the webinar because of space and time constraints. We did this on temperatures, which we think is basically the main risk on the forecast, and also wind load factors. And these sensitivities are now possible because we have this improved methodological approach for EU27 countries, where we can model bottom up and have very high resolution visibility on all of these countries. Here on your left, you can see the example sensitivity profiles for temperature, which we then translate into heating degree days. One interesting thing to see is that in our temperature forecast, you see the high case demand is the dotted line in orange. In October is very close to our base case, and this is because we're already expecting a very cold October, almost at the highest or at the coldest level that we have in our high demand case. As we go into the forecast horizon, then the range begins opening a little bit more, but we're already thinking that the early part of the winter will be colder than normal. Then we also have these wind load factor sensitivity profiles and assumptions. However, just also take into consideration what we're already accounting for increased capacity in wind generation. So even if the utilization rate, for example, in the best case seems relatively flat, in reality, there's higher wind generation because we're already seeing some increased capacity over here, and also increased capacity in our forecast in other generation technologies, for example, like nuclear. Other winter risks, we're not modeling because of space and time here, but we can also do for our clients are nuclear outages in France, Belgium, or the Netherlands, what's happening with ghost to coal switching, hydro generation, increased competition with LNG Asia. So we now have a very robust way of looking at risks in the European gas market. And the results of our sensitivity analysis will be shown in the next slide. Please, Ron. Yeah, and essentially we are seeing a net downside risk to demand compared to our base case. If we look at the plot on the left, we can have the regional breakdown of winter gas demand by scenario. We can see the volatility. In Northwest Europe and rest of Europe being higher than what's happening in Southern Europe, just by the difference in the sizes of the bars. And overall, what this sums up to is that we have in the low demand case, this is in the case that there's a warm winter, but also high wind utilization rates. The low demand case points to a minus 14 BCM reduction, while the high case points to an 11.2 BCM increase. So this results in a net downside risk of around 3 BCM. So there's the likelihood there that we will have lower demand, especially if a warm winter materializes. We see that's the net risk. And if we go on to the chart on the right-hand side, we can see that November, February are particularly months where this net risk, especially compared to last year, can be quite strong. And just can we move to the next slide, please? Just to show now how we're looking at this in terms of the sectoral breakdown. Now with the models, we can do these sectoral breakdowns, particularly for Northwest Europe and Southern Europe. We do this for the 8 specific countries, but here for space constraints, we're showing you the full aggregate picture. And we can see first that regional non-power gas consumption, which includes distribution or residential and commercial sectors and the industrial sector, actually is the driving force behind gas demand during the winter. And this is because of the exposure to temperatures in the case of some thermosensitive countries, for in the industrial complex like Germany and to some extent France, where gas is used as a heating vector in the industrial processes. We can also have this exposure to temperatures. And this is shown in the plot to the left-hand side. But if we go on the plot to the right-hand side, we can also see what are the net risks for gas for power consumption by region. While these numbers are in BCM, you can almost translate them one-to-one to percentages. So we're already seeing, like in Northwest Europe, is around that minus 2%. Is a minus 2% net downside risk, and also for Southern Europe, something quite similar. As you can see, the net downside risk is actually quite similar between the two regions, which is interesting. But the volatility, as measured by the size of the bars in Southern Europe, is larger. And this is because in South Europe, hydro generation plays a very important role, especially going into the late parts of the winter. Hydro generation actually can displace both gas and wind. So this leads then to this increased volatility in Southern Europe, whereas in the case of Northwest Europe, gas for power demand depends on some extent wind generation, but we have also the baseload power of nuclear, which is very stable, which reduces this volatility sensitivity over here. And finally, just to summarize, and before going to the Q&A section, we will present the main takeaways for our winter outlook. US and Canada to lead the LNG supply additions, driving the market growth this winter. 21% for US increase year on year, almost 5 BCM from LNG Canada to adding to the Pacific Basin, which is quite strong, suggesting a very ample supply coming into the winter. Also, Europe and Asia LNG demand growing by 20 million tons this winter, and with Northeast Asian LNG inventories remaining in a comfortable position under a normal winter, we don't expect also strong competition with Europe. Gas supply addition to keep pressure on spot prices in 2025-26 winter under our current seasonal averages assumptions. Of course, this is something we're monitoring, and every month as we publish our new report, we adjust this view, and now also provide these risk profiles to our clients. So Ron, handing it back to you.
Thank you, everyone, for this presentation. Yeah, I just wanted to remind you that, all of this content and the analysis that we have just shown are part of, the content that we produce at Kepler Inside. So we have news coverage, we have our monthly reports for supply and demand, covering, most regions in the world. We also have weekly reports where we keep clients up to date with development in the market. So feel free to if you're curious, just contact us, and we can talk about our offering in more detail. With this, thank you so much. I think we have already answered a bunch of questions that I saw coming in. We might still need, still have a few minutes for questions. I have one that I can see here that is what impact can we see on Chinese LNG demand this winter if US-China trade tensions escalate? I think that's one for you, Go.
Yeah, thanks, Ron. Yeah, so already US LNG to China is very uncompetitive with the existing tariffs. So on top of this, tit for tat tariffs continue, China already has a lot of term contracts as well. So spot demand is already pushed out by domestic production and pipeline imports. So additional tariffs mean, even more depressing GDP growth for China. So in our base case, we do see China growing at 5%. But if this continues for tit for tat, this is going to influence the economy, and we see, a 1% reduction in GDP. And then at an annualized level, that's a 1 million ton reduction. So quite big impact over the winter. We can say that that's about 500,000 ton impact, around 9 or 10 cargoes less for China. So hopefully it doesn't keep escalating, but if it does, then this is a bearish impact on Chinese demand, but also on Asian demand.
Nice, thank you, Go. We also have like a few questions on Ukraine. One of them, how much do you expect Ukraine to import during the winter season? The other one, what's the upside to Ukraine pull on EU-27 in the case of further attacks in your view? So like we were expecting some of these questions, like given like how relevant it is for the European market. We had prepared like a slide for that I can show you. Of course, the current situation in Ukraine is quite uncertain, given that it's hard to assess like the impact of the recent strikes. What we can share with you is like the following thing. Of course, we saw like strikes happening that Naftogaz reported on the 3rd and the 5th of October. Here in this plot, you can see like the evolution of net underground gas storage injections and also the average temperatures and the pipeline import. So basically, we haven't seen since then, I guess, like any significant change in pipeline imports, from the European Union. That said, one of the reasons why it's very hard to assess, this reduction in net injections into gas storage levels is because as the strikes happened, also the region was going through a cold snap, and actually it's still going through like a period of lower temperatures compared to like earlier in September. So like it's hard to assess if this net reduction in injections is due to the cold snap or the reduction in domestic production, or a combination of both. That said, we have analyzed what's been happening in terms of imports and how Ukraine has been booking capacity. As you can see here on this chart, so basically what we confirm is that most capacity that has been booked for Q4 is being booked on a monthly basis. So like basically towards the end of the month, or like third week of the month, like this capacity is booked via Hungary, Poland, and Slovakia for the most part. And so it's hard to see Ukraine, in our view, kind of like going for significant day ahead buying, because this is very expensive compared to like other auctions, particularly via Slovakia, as we know is the most expensive market. So like what we are expecting to see is basically Ukraine to continue relying on imports from Hungary and from Poland. And of course, in the event of like something absolutely dramatic in terms of attacks on domestic infrastructure and storage facilities, we could see imports from Ukraine ramping up like significantly. But like that's not our base case. In our base case, what we are expecting to see is like for Ukraine to continue importing from the European Union for at around 4 BCM in total. So that's our assessment so far, mostly driven by flows via Poland and Hungary. We are watching this like very closely. So yeah, happy to take more questions via email on this. With this, I have a few minutes that I can give to Virgil, who is gonna demo the Kepler platform. Please, Virgil.
Yeah. Thank you, Ronald, for the presentation. Great insight always. So my name is Virgil. I'm customer success at Kepler, and today I would like to show you how you can use the Kepler terminal to analyze like what's happening in Northwest Europe. So let me just share my screen and let me know if you can see it, Ronald. That should come very soon.
Yes,
yeah.
we can.
Perfect. So you've seen today a lot of data from the analysts at Kepler. One of the main sources that they're using for the data is obviously Kepler Terminal for feed their analysis. So what I want to show you today first is the live map here, where you can see the activity for all the LNG vessels that we're tracking at Kepler. The good thing with that live map is that you can customize it for a specific need. So here, for example, let's say we want to see all the vessels that are going to discharge in Northwest Europe. So you can actually use here on the left a location filter and add a destination. Here in the example, let's use Northwest Europe zone. I will also add a product search for LNG, so I'm only focusing on the LNG tankers and not any other commodity that Kepler is tracking. So as soon as you do that, you will see that the live map is now only reflecting like all the Northwest Europe zone import of LNG. You have a summary of all the activities on the right, so all the loading and discharging operation. And because we want to make your work efficient when you're using the Kepler terminal, we are going to build a dashboard to avoid to do repetitive tasks. So if this is something that you're looking regularly, what you can do, you can actually pin that to a dashboard. We can create a new dashboard and name it like Northwest Europe imports LNG. And by doing that, you will avoid to do a repetitive task. So you see that now, as soon as I add that element to the dashboard, it's brought to a new window where you can monitor and edit your dashboard. So this map is interactive. So as soon as there is a new vessel indicating a discharge in Northwest Europe, it will be added into the live map. Another element that now you can track, it's also within the cargo section. So within the cargo section, you can track flows of LNGs between two countries, port or installation. So here it's just an aggregation of all the loading and discharging operation that we are aggregating at different frequency, monthly, daily, weekly, you can decide. So it's very easy to use the Kepler terminal. On the left, you have the parameter to set up your chart. So here, if we pick the same example, let's say you want to look still at Northwest Europe zone. You want to see the import and of course LNG. So here the chart is providing you an overview of what Northwest Europe zone has been importing, what will also import in the future, because we're also providing forecast based on different source, AIS, port authorities, analyst comment also like Ronald or Charles. And one very powerful feature that we have in Kepler, it's the split function here in the bottom left. So the next question that you might wonder is from where Northwest Europe is sourcing the LNG. So you can split by origin countries, for example, and you will see that obviously US is leading the supply for that zone. You can see also the decrease for Russian Federation if we compare with last year data. This is interactive as well, so you can click on the data for US in September, and you can see all the vessels that loaded LNG from US and discharged it to Northwest Europe. You can see players involved, buyer, seller, charterer, and also what's the source for the cargo on board. Again, the idea here is to avoid repetitive tasks, so you can add this chart to a dashboard. So we already have our dashboard here called Northwest Europe Import LNG. Another split is the split by destination countries. So here, opposite view, what is the distribution within Northwest Europe? So we can add that also to our dashboard. And one new split that we've added this year that is quite useful is the split by LNG trade type. So here, if you do that, you will see how much of the LNG imported by Northwest Europe is from contract that has been like signed for long term, or for example, spot prices. So here you can see that there is an increase, for example, of spot prices for Northwest Europe zone, and we can add that element also into our dashboard. We are almost done with our dashboard. The last element that I want to highlight, it's in the fleet metrics here next to flows. So we are tracking floating storage, which is very important for Europe as we're entering we're already in a high season. So here, same principle than in flows data, we can select Europe and LNG. And here what the chart is giving us as an indication. Let's extend a bit the time period for the last 5 years. So here, this is the amount of LNG that we have in vessels that are acting as floating storage. So these are based on different criteria: speed of the vessel, change of direction, And you can see that we have a slight increase of the floating storage since the beginning of the year, which is expected with the high season coming up. But you can see that it has nothing to do with what we have experienced in the past 2 to 3 years, especially in 2022 when we got the LNG prices crisis. You can also use here the split by currencies. So you can see where the vessels are located in Europe, and you can highlight like some specific area where you have a high number of vessels that are acting as floating storage. So last element to add into our dashboard, we can have it here. We can go back now to our dashboard, and you will see that you have all the elements in one page. You have your arrival of vessel, and then all the flows chart of Northwest Europe zone. So this is how people use Kepler basically on their day-to-day activity. For the people that have access to Kepler, we will send you the link of the dashboard so you can access it easily when you are using the terminal. For the people that don't have access to the Kepler terminal, you will receive an email after the call where you can request a trial access, and you will also have access to that dashboard to start working on the platform. Thank you for your time, and back to you, Ronald.
Thank you, Virgil. It was very insightful, and thank you everyone for joining the webinar. Thank you for to the presenters. Yeah, I think we've come to the end of the webinar. I hope you found it insightful, and please reach out if you have any other questions. Thank you. Bye.